Part 4. Genesis of a Communist. Childhood. On the 5 or 6 sets of questions I had submitted on different matters, Mao had talked for a dozen nights, hardly ever referring to himself or his own role in some of the events described. I was beginning to think it was hopeless to expect him to give me such details. He obviously considered the individual of very little importance. Like other Reds I met, he tended to talk only about committees, organizations, armies, resolutions, battles, tactics, measures, and so on, and seldom of personal experience. For a while I thought this reluctance to expand on subjective matters, or even the exploits of their comrades as individuals, might derive from modesty, or fear or suspicion of me, or a consciousness of the price so many of these men had on their heads. Later on I discovered that that was not so much the case as it was that most of them actually did not remember personal details. As I began collecting biographies, I found repeatedly that the communist would be able to tell everything that had happened in his early youth, but once he had become identified with the Red Army he lost himself somewhere, and without repeated questioning one could hear nothing more about him, but only stories of the army, or the Soviets, or the party capitalized. These men could talk indefinitely about dates and circumstances of battles, and movements to and from 1,000 unheard of places, but those events seemed to have had significance for them only collectively, not because they as individuals had made history there, but because the Red Army had been there, and behind it the whole organic force of an ideology for which they were fighting. It was an interesting discovery, but it made difficult reporting. One night when all other questions had been satisfied, Mao turned to the list I had headed, Personal History. He smiled at a question, "How many times have you been married?" And the rumor later spread that I had asked Mao how many wives he had. He was skeptical, anyway, about the necessity for supplying an autobiography. But I argued that in a way that was more important than information on other matters. People want to know what sort of man you are, I said, when they read what you say. Then you ought also to correct some of the false rumors circulated. I reminded him of various reports of his death, how some people believed he spoke fluent French, while others said he was an ignorant peasant, how one report described him as a half-dead tubercular, while others maintained that he was a mad fanatic. He seemed mildly surprised that people should spend their time speculating about him. He agreed that such reports ought to be corrected. Then he looked over the items again, as I had written them down. "Suppose," he said at last, "that I just disregard your questions, and instead give you a general sketch of my life. I think it will be more understandable, and in the end all of your questions will be answered just the same." During the nightly interviews that followed we were like conspirators indeed, huddled in that cave over the red-covered table, with sputtering candles between us. I wrote until I was ready to fall asleep. Wu Yangping sat next to me and interpreted Mao's soft southern dialect, in which a chicken, instead of being a good substantial northern kai, became a romantic gi, and Hunan became Funa, and a bowl of ch turned into tsa. And many much stranger variations occurred. Mao related everything from memory, and I put it down as he talked. It was, as I have said, retranslated and corrected, and this is the result, with no attempt to give it literary excellence, beyond some necessary corrections in the syntax of the patient Mr. Wu. I was born in the village of Shaoshan, in Shangti Ensin *, Hunan Province, in 1893.1. My father's name was Mao Jinsheng Nao Shunsheng, and my mother's maiden name was Wen Chi Mei. My father was a poor peasant and while still young was obliged to join the army because of heavy debts. He was a soldier for many years. Later on he returned to the village where I was born, and by saving carefully and gathering together a little money through small trading and other enterprise he managed to buy back his land. As middle peasants then my family owned 15 mo of land. On this they could raise 60 tan of rice a year. The 5 members of the family consumed a total of 35 tan, that is, about 7 each, which left an annual surplus of 25 tan. Using this surplus, my father accumulated a little capital and in time purchased 7 more mo, which gave the family the status of rich peasants. We could then raise 84 tan of rice a year. When I was 10 years of age and the family owned only 15 mo of land, the 5 members of the family consisted of my father, mother, grandfather, younger brother, and myself. After we had acquired the additional 7 mo, my grandfather died, but there came another younger brother. However, we still had a surplus of 49 tan of rice each year, and on this my father steadily prospered. At the time my father was a middle peasant, he began to deal in grain transport and selling, by which he made a little money. After he became a rich peasant, he devoted most of his time to that business. He hired a full-time farm laborer, and put his children to work on the farm, as well as his wife. I began to work at farming tasks when I was 6 years old. My father had no shop for his business. He simply purchased grain from the poor farmers and then transported it to the city merchants, where he got a higher price. In the winter, when the rice was being ground, he hired an extra laborer to work on the farm, so that at that time there were 7 mouths to feed. My family ate frugally, but had enough always. I began studying in a local primary school when I was 8 and remained there until I was 13 years old. In the early morning and at night I worked on the farm. During the day I read the Confucian Analects and the 4 classics. My Chinese teacher belonged to the stern treatment school. He was harsh and severe, frequently beating his students. Because of that I ran away from the school when I was 10. I was afraid to return home for fear of receiving a beating there, and set out in the general direction of the city, which I believed to be in a valley somewhere. I wandered for 3 days before I was finally found by my family. Then I learned that I had circled round and round in my travels, and in all my walking had got only about 8 li from my home. After my return to the family, however, to my surprise conditions somewhat improved. My father was slightly more considerate and the teacher was more inclined to moderation. The result of my act of protest impressed me very much. It was a successful strike. My father wanted me to begin keeping the family books as soon as I had learned a few characters. He wanted me to learn to use the abacus. As my father insisted upon this, I began to work at those accounts at night. He was a severe taskmaster. He hated to see me idle, and if there were no books to be kept, he put me to work at farm tasks. He was a hot-tempered man and frequently beat both me and my brothers. He gave us no money whatever, and the most meager food. On the 15th of every month he made a concession to his laborers and gave them eggs with their rice, but never meat. To me he gave neither eggs nor meat. My mother was a kind woman, generous and sympathetic, and ever ready to share what she had. She pitied the poor and often gave them rice when they came to ask for it during famines. But she could not do so when my father was present. He disapproved of charity. We had many quarrels in my home over this question. There were 2 parties in the family. One was my father, the ruling power. The opposition was made up of myself, my mother, my brother, and sometimes even the laborer. In the united front of the opposition, however, there was a difference of opinion. My mother advocated a policy of indirect attack. She criticized any overt display of emotion and attempts at open rebellion against the ruling power. She said it was not the Chinese way. But when I was 13 I discovered a powerful argument of my own for debating with my father on his own ground, by quoting the classics. My father's favorite accusations against me were of unfilial conduct and laziness. I quoted, in exchange, passages from the classics saying that the elder must be kind and affectionate. Against his charge that I was lazy I used the rebuttal that older people should do more work than younger, that my father was over 3 times as old as myself, and therefore should do more work. And I declared that when I was his age I would be much more energetic. The old man continued to amass wealth, or what was considered to be a great fortune in that little village. He did not buy more land himself, but he bought many mortgages on other people's land. His capital grew to 2,000 or 3,000 Chinese dollars. My dissatisfaction increased. The dialectical struggle in our family was constantly developing. One incident I especially remember. When I was about 13 my father invited many guests to his home, and while they were present a dispute arose between the 2 of us. My father denounced me before the whole group, calling me lazy and useless. This infuriated me. I cursed him and left the house. My mother ran after me and tried to persuade me to return. My father also pursued me, cursing at the same time that he commanded me to come back. I reached the edge of a pond and threatened to jump in if he came any nearer. In this situation demands and counter-demands were presented for cessation of the civil war. My father insisted that I apologize and kutu asterisk as a sign of submission. I agreed to give a 1 ni kutu if he would promise not to beat me. Thus the war ended, and from it I learned that when I defended my rights by open rebellion my father relented, but when I remained meek and submissive he only cursed and beat me the more. Reflecting on this, I think that in the end the strictness of my father defeated him. I learned to hate him, and we created a real united front against him. At the same time, it probably benefited me. It made me most diligent in my work. It made me keep my books carefully, so that he should have no basis for criticizing me. My father had had 2 years of schooling and he could read enough to keep books. My mother was wholly illiterate. Both were from peasant families. I was the family scholar. I knew the classics, but disliked them. What I enjoyed were the romances of old China, and especially stories of rebellions. I read the Youfei Chuan, the Youfei Chronicles, Shui Hu Chuan, the Water Margin, Fan Tiang Revolt against the Tang, San Kuo, the Three Kingdoms, and Siu Kai Travels in the West. The story of Xuanzang's 7th century semi-legendary pilgrimage to India, while still very young. And despite the vigilance of my old teacher, who hated these outlawed books and called them wicked, I used to read them in school, covering them up with a classic when the teacher walked past. So also did most of my schoolmates. We learned many of the stories almost by heart, and discussed and rediscussed them many times. We knew more of them than the old men of the village, who also loved them and used to exchange stories with us. I believe that perhaps I was much influenced by such books, read at an impressionable age. I finally left the primary school when I was 13 and began to work long hours on the farm, helping the hired laborer, doing the full labor of a man during the day and at night keeping books for my father. Nevertheless, I succeeded in continuing my reading, devouring everything I could find except the classics. This annoyed my father, who wanted me to master the classics, especially after he was defeated in a lawsuit because of an apt classical quotation used by his adversary in the Chinese court. I used to cover up the window of my room late at night so that my father would not see the light. In this way I read a book called Sheng Shiwen Words of Warning, which I liked very much. The author, one of a number of old reformist scholars, thought that the weakness of China lay in her lack of Western appliances, railways, telephones, telegraphs, and steamships, and wanted to have them introduced into the country. My father considered such books a waste of time. He wanted me to read something practical like the classics, which could help him in winning lawsuits. I continued to read the old romances and tales of Chinese literature. It occurred to me one day that there was one thing peculiar about such stories, and that was the absence of peasants who tilled the land. All the characters were warriors, officials, or scholars. There was never a peasant hero. I wondered about this for 2 years, and then I analyzed the content of the stories. I found that they all glorified men of arms, rulers of the people, who did not have to work the land, because they owned and controlled it and evidently made the peasants work it for them. My father was in his early days, and in middle age, a skeptic, but my mother devoutly worshipped Buddha. She gave her children religious instruction, and we were all saddened that our father was an unbeliever. When I was 9 years old, I seriously discussed the problem of my father's lack of piety with my mother. We made many attempts then and later on to convert him, but without success. He only cursed us, and, overwhelmed by his attacks, we withdrew to devise new plans. But he would have nothing to do with the gods. My reading gradually began to influence me. However, I myself became more and more skeptical. My mother became concerned about me, and scolded me for my indifference to the requirements of the faith, but my father made no comment. Then one day he went out on the road to collect some money, and on his way he met a tiger. The tiger was surprised at the encounter and fled at once, but my father was even more astonished and afterwards reflected a good deal on his miraculous escape. He began to wonder if he had not offended the gods. From then on he showed more respect to Buddhism and burned incense now and then. Yet when my own backsliding grew worse, the old man did not interfere. He prayed to the gods only when he was in difficulties. Sheng Shiwen Words of Warning stimulated in me a desire to resume my studies. I had also become disgusted with my labor on the farm. My father naturally opposed me, we quarreled about it, and finally I ran away from home. I went to the home of an unemployed law student, and there I studied for half a year. After that I studied more of the classics under an old Chinese scholar, and also read many contemporary articles and a few books. At this time an incident occurred in Hunan which influenced my whole life. Outside the little Chinese school where I was studying, we students noticed many bean merchants coming back from Changsha. We asked them why they were all leaving. They told us about a big uprising in the city. There had been a severe famine that year, and in Changsha thousands were without food. The starving sent a delegation to the civil governor to beg for relief, but he replied to them haughtily, "Why haven to you food? There is plenty in the city. I always have enough. When the people were told the governor's reply, they became very angry. They held mass meetings and organized a demonstration. They attacked the Manchuyama, cut down the flagpole, the symbol of office, and drove out the governor. Following this, the Commissioner of Internal Affairs, a man named Chang, came out on his horse and told the people that the government would take measures to help them. Chang was evidently sincere in his promise, but the emperor disliked him and accused him of having intimate connections with the mob. He was removed. A new governor arrived, and at once ordered the arrest of the leaders of the uprising. Many of them were beheaded and their heads displayed on poles as a warning to future rebels. This incident was discussed in my school for many days. It made a deep impression on me. Most of the other students sympathized with the insurrectionists, but only from an observer's point of view. They did not understand that it had any relation to their own lives. They were merely interested in it as an exciting incident. I never forgot it. I felt that there with the rebels were ordinary people like my own family, and I deeply resented the injustice of the treatment given to them. Not long afterward, in Shaoshan, there was a conflict between members of the Gelauhui, a secret society, and a local landlord. He sued them in court, and as he was a powerful landlord, he easily bought a decision favorable to himself. The Gelauhui members were defeated. But instead of submitting, they rebelled against the landlord and the government and withdrew to a local mountain called Liuher, where they built a stronghold. Troops were sent against them, and the landlord spread a story that they had sacrificed a child when they raised the banner of revolt. The leader of the rebels was called Piang the millstone maker. They were finally suppressed and Piang was forced to flee. He was eventually captured and beheaded. In the eyes of the students, however, he was a hero, for all sympathized with the revolt. Next year, when the new rice was not yet harvested and the winter rice was exhausted, there was a food shortage in our district. The poor demanded help from the rich farmers, and they began a movement called Eat Rice Without Charge. Xinghao, my father was a rice merchant and was exporting much grain to the city from our district, despite the shortage. One of his consignments was seized by the poor villagers and his wrath was boundless. I did not sympathize with him. At the same time, I thought the villagers' method was wrong also. Another influence on me at this time was the presence in a local primary school of a radical teacher. He was radical because he was opposed to Buddhism and wanted to get rid of the gods. He urged people to convert their temples into schools. He was a widely discussed personality. I admired him and agreed with his views. These incidents, occurring close together, made lasting impressions on my young mind, already rebellious. In this period also I began to have a certain amount of political consciousness, especially after I read a pamphlet telling of the dismemberment of China. I remember even now that this pamphlet opened with the sentence, "Alas, China will be subjugated." It told of Japan's occupation of Korea and Taiwan, of the loss of suzerainty in Indochina, Burma, and elsewhere. After I read this, I felt depressed about the future of my country and began to realize that it was the duty of all the people to help save it. My father had decided to apprentice me to a rice shop in Shangtan, with which he had connections. I was not opposed to it at first, thinking it might be interesting. But about this time I heard of an unusual new school and made up my mind to go there, despite my father's opposition. This school was in Shangshan, where my mother's family lived. A cousin of mine was a student there, and he told me of the new school and of the changing conditions in modern education. There was less emphasis on the classics, and more was taught of the new knowledge of the West. The educational methods, also, were quite radical. I went to the school with my cousin and registered. I claimed to be a Shangshan man, because I understood that the school was open only to natives of Shangshan. Later on I took my true status as a Shangtian native when I discovered that the place was open to all. I paid 1,400 coppers here for 5 months, board, lodging, and all materials necessary for study. My father finally agreed to let me enter, after friends had argued to him that this advanced education would increase my earning powers. This was the first time I had been as far away from home as 50 li. I was 16 years old. In the new school I could study natural science and new subjects of Western learning. Another notable thing was that one of the teachers was a returned student from Japan, and he wore a false queue. It was quite easy to tell that his queue was false. Everyone laughed at him and called him the false foreign devil. I had never before seen so many children together. Most of them were sons of landlords, wearing expensive clothes. Very few peasants could afford to send their children to such a school. I was more poorly dressed than the others. I owned only one decent coat and trousers suit. Gowns were not worn by students, but only by the teachers, and none but foreign devils wore foreign clothes. Many of the richer students despised me because usually I was wearing my ragged coat and trousers. However, among them I had friends, and two especially were my good comrades. One of those is now a writer, living in Soviet Russia. I was also disliked because I was not a native of Shaanxi. It was very important to be a native of Shaanxi and also important to be from a certain district of Shaanxi. There was an upper, lower, and middle district, and lower and upper were continually fighting, purely on a regional basis. Neither could become reconciled to the existence of the other. I took a neutral position in this war, because I was not a native at all. Consequently, all three factions despised me. I felt spiritually very depressed. I made good progress at this school. The teachers liked me, especially those who taught the classics, because I wrote good essays in the classical manner. But my mind was not on the classics. I was reading two books sent to me by my cousin, telling of the reform movement of Kang Yue. One was by Liang Chicho, editor of the Sin Ts Sung Pao New People S Miscellany. I read and reread those books until I knew them by heart. I worshipped Kang Yue and Liang Chicho, and was very grateful to my cousin, whom I then thought very progressive, but who later became a counter-revolutionary, a member of the gentry, and joined the reactionaries in the period of the Great Revolution of 1925-27. Many of the students disliked the false foreign devil because of his inhuman cue, but I liked hearing him talk about Japan. He taught music and English. One of his songs was Japanese and was called The Battle on the Yellow Sea. I still remember some charming words from it. The sparrow sings, the nightingale dances, and the green fields are lovely in the spring. The pomegranate flowers crimson, the willows are green-leaved, and there is a new picture. At that time I knew and felt the beauty of Japan, and felt something of her pride and might, in this song of her victory over Russia. I did not think there was also a barbarous Japan, the Japan we know today. This is all I learned from the false foreign devil. I recall also that at about this time I first heard that the Emperor and Tu-Si, the Empress Dowager, were both dead, although the new Emperor, Shuntung Puyi, had already been ruling for 2 years. I was not yet an anti-monarchist. Indeed, I considered the Emperor as well as most officials to be honest, good, and clever men. They only needed the help of Kang Yue's reforms. I was fascinated by accounts of the rulers of ancient China, Yao, Shun, Ch and Shi Huangti, and Han Wuti, and read many books about them. I also learned something of foreign history at this time, and of geography. I had first heard of America in an article which told of the American Revolution and contained a sentence like this: after 8 years of difficult war, Washington won victory and built up his nation. In a book called Great Heroes of the World, I read also of Napoleon, Catherine of Russia, Peter the Great, Wellington, Gladstone, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and Lincoln.